Like many of us, my parents used to love attending live events before the pandemic struck. From sporting events to concerts, the atmosphere, as well as maybe being a little too physically close to strangers, brought them a sense of excitement and enjoyment. I can specifically recall one event that they were elated about: Billy Joel live at Lambeau Field. The music of Billy Joel had defined their childhoods, and they had been in anticipation for months to see him perform. Now, I'd like you to imagine they're in line inside of the atrium on the way to get to their seats. They get their tickets checked, and they're directed to their ADA accommodated seats due to my dad's physical disability. Until security stops my parents, and they are told that they are required to escort my dad by wheelchair because of his disability. Now, I'd like you to keep in mind, my dad has a below-the-knee amputation, had been post-rehab for almost 5 years at this point, meaning that he is fully capable of walking independently. He just requires some extra assistance in case of emergency. The security staff insists on taking my dad by wheelchair, and he reluctantly agrees. As he's being wheeled to his seat, brought to his chair, and they arrive, the security staff dumps him out of the wheelchair and onto the ground. My mom later arrives to find my dad lying on the floor with nobody to help him. And in that moment, my parents had a few choice words regarding the lack of appropriate accommodations for my dad's needs. Like most societal labels that define us, I'm sure we all have some sort of preconceived idea of what somebody who is disabled looks like. Before my dad became physically disabled, I had always associated the term with a complete inability to walk, or speak, or even hear. But many people lack the fundamental education to understand that disability lies on a spectrum, and accommodation is not this one-size-fits-all solution. I am going to touch on the importance of practicing awareness regarding disability by first talking about getting rid of the preconceived ideas of the disabled community. Secondly, talking about accommodation as a spectrum and not a one-size-fits-all solution. And finally, bringing to light the importance of everyday acts of ableism that can be better modified in order to include the disabled community. Now, I'm sure we have all mindlessly scrolled through social media and seen that video. There's a nasty Karen rolling the camera as a seemingly able-bodied young woman pulls into that handicapped spot at the grocery store. She is the villain of the story, until, of course, she is given the time and the platform to explain herself. Everyone is ingrained to have a preconceived notion of how somebody who is disabled looks like. However, according to the law offices of Cavi and Barrett, 19% of U.S. citizens are considered disabled, and this equates to roughly 62 million people. Of these 62 million, it is also estimated that 1 in 4 experience some form of discrimination at least once a day. Interacting with someone who struggles with a disability, whether physical or mental, is not uncommon. And rarely will you understand how or why a stranger struggles with things that may come easier to someone who is neurotypical or able-bodied. Even some of the most debilitating physical disabilities are not always able to be seen by the naked eye. According to the University of Massachusetts, 10% of people in the U.S. struggle with what is qualified as an invisible disability, and this includes a wide range of conditions related to mental health, chronic fatigue, pain, and lung disease. This makes up most people in the United States who are considered disabled. Yet many people still have this idea of what makes up the outward appearance of a disabled person. An essential step that you can take to get rid of your impressions of disability is not making assumptions based on solely physical ability. I can specifically recall one experience I had with seemingly discreet discrimination against my dad that struck a nerve and made me realize that there are going to be a lot of people out there who don't consider him disabled enough. In a particularly nasty verbal altercation with our neighbor, my dad talked about how we needed an accessible parking spot behind our 2-car garage. My neighbor, red in the face, yelling at my dad for parking too close to the back of his truck, retorts, and he says, Well, I've seen you take your dog around the block, and I've seen you take the trash out every week. You can't be that crippled. This particular instance made me all the more protective and aware of how people with disabilities face discrimination every single day. What started as an innocent butting of heads between neighbors became a personal attack on my dad and his needs. Although this comment was brash and he probably did not realize the intense punch that it packed, he made it very clear that it is important to wipe away the expectations and ideas that we have created of the disabled community. In the same way that disability can be identified on a spectrum, the same can be said for accommodation. Many disabled people have to deal with a lack of appropriate accessibility or even a lack of accommodation entirely in order to navigate their everyday lives. According to the United States Commission on Civil Rights and their research in the quality of life in disabled citizens, although the passing of the ADA caused a profound change in accessibility for the disabled community, there are still many people that struggle with a lack of accessibility and accommodation. In short, although the government standard in the treatment of disabled people has improved, there are many communities that still feel left out and put to the wayside. Being aware of the spectrum of disability and speaking out about a lack of accessibility for a variety of disabled people is one of the most critical steps in becoming actively anti-discriminatory. Someone with a prosthetic body part, for example, that has mobility issues, is not going to need the same level of care and accessibility as somebody who is completely unable to walk. The Lambeau Field staff followed a given protocol in my father's case. However, they did not take the time to think about the implications of the way they treated my dad and his disability. This later proved to be harmful and quite honestly embarrassing. Being cognizant of proper accommodation and adjusting protocol to make all people feel represented is one of the easiest ways to improve the standard of accessibility in public accommodation and everyday life. We must collectively work to become anti-ableist in order to improve the lives of disabled people around us. It has been reported that 67% of people surveyed by the disability-based charity Scope Out today find that interacting with disabled people makes them uncomfortable. Now, whether this can be attributed to a lack of education or a lack of exposure, there is still a lingering societal stigma. In the same way that we profile physical disability, I'm sure many of us have grown up to believe that autism similarly presents and looks a certain way. However, according to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, 1 in 54 children in the United States have been identified on the autism spectrum. As the name suggests, autism is a spectrum, and it presents differently in every single person diagnosed with it. The Center for Disease Control also published a list of ways that we can further develop our interactions with disabled people and become actively anti-ableist. And this includes a wide range of practices related to non-discrimination and fair treatment, creating more inclusive product designs, and utilizing universal designs in writing, modifying items and procedures to better include the disabled community, and eliminating the stigma and stereotypes associated with disability. Again, this is a list of simple things that we can do every day to improve the lives of the disabled community. However, many times these are tasks that prove difficult when put in a situation where you are directly interacting with disabled people. So how do we get over this stigma and truly improve the quality of accommodation for disabled people? Don't use that handicap parking spot unless you are equipped with a proper placard or license plate. Even if you have to go, save that accessible bathroom stall for someone else. Only purchase ADA tickets at events if you need them. And finally, treat the disabled community as they are, people.